Give it a few more minutes. I see the attendees filling up. All right, I think we have quite the number to start. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you're joining us from around the world. My name is Mads Palihapitiya. I'm with the Atrocity Prevention Lab at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where I work as the early warning consultant. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this second event in our ongoing webinar series on expanding the frontiers of atrocity prevention. Today we have a special treat for you. Today's discussion centers on the theme that sits at the heart of both research and practice, and it's called Knowledge Commons and Global Practices for Atrocity Prevention. So if this is not the webinar you were trying to join, maybe you should check your link. But if this is, then you are in for a real treat as we look at global institutions that face political transitions, funding cuts, staff turnover, and the risk of losing institutional memory, really an important part of this conversation, where this threat or this uncertainty has never been greater. Valuable data, lessons learned, and even the relationship that sustain prevention work or prevention networks are disappearing, sometimes literally overnight as websites or repositories vanish. So this webinar brings together three experts who I am really proud to introduce. And they work at different levels of the prevention ecosystem, from academic research and documentation to network mapping to frontline early warning, early action work, to explore how we can protect, share, and sustain knowledge as a public good essential to atrocity prevention. Now, let me quickly introduce the three panelists before we begin our conversation and the presentations. First up is Dr. Samantha Larkin, a genocide studies scholar and faculty member at UMass Boston. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development, and her focus is on transitional justice, institutional memory, and documentation practices. And Samantha reminds us that the disappearance of online learning hubs like USAID's Learning Hub and the loss of key personnel have created a crisis of institutional amnesia. Second up is Nate Haken, the former vice president at the Fund for Peace, who has led an extraordinary decade-long network mapping project across 15 West African countries. His work visualizing more than 1,700 organizations and 21 relationships will be the key at this webinar, where he's captured the relational architecture of peace building, the social networks that sustain collaboration long after projects end. And third, Peter Mwamachi, a leading early warning and peace-building practitioner based in Kenya, drawing on his experience with Ueno Platform for Peace. Peter knows firsthand how political transitions, funding cycles, and data sensitivities can threaten continuity. And we'll be talking about his ideas about developing stronger local ownership, sustainable systems, and policies that embed early warning, early action mechanisms within national frameworks. All right, so with that, I want to turn it over to our keynote speaker, Dr. Samantha Larkin. Take it away. Also, as Sam is presenting, please introduce yourselves as requested by Gillian.
As many times as we can practice sharing screens in advance, it always seems to have a glitch hiccup when we actually try to do it in real time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Are you able to hear me okay? Great. Um, so I'm going to take the next 15 minutes or so to speak about knowledge commons and global practices for atrocity prevention. Um, and I'm going to speak from my experience as an academic and as a consultant, not from my experience working at the U.S. State Department. So this is these are my own views, again, not representing HHI or representing my current employer, but from my more than 15 years of academic work in genocide prevention, atrocity prevention, and understanding the spaces by which knowledge is produced and also can be lost at, sort of at once. And so, what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the problem, talk about why it matters, which may seem obvious, but we'll talk a little bit about that. I want to discuss the scope of the problem. I want to talk about a case study, and thank some of the atrocity prevention practitioners who have been kind enough to discuss some of the knowledge losses with me. Um, there are some possible ways forward, and then a very brief call to action that will bridge together organizations, universities, governments, et cetera. So that's what we'll do today, nice and quick. So the problem is, and there is actually more to this problem than I'm including here, but these are the aspects that I'll be able to focus on today. So since January 2025, we have witnessed an intentional undoing of knowledge commons. This means that full program, project, and department repositories, including research, data sets, evaluations, proposals, and other information, are being taken offline and essentially erased. Um, so one part of the problem is that things that have been created are being taken down, also known as vanishing data right now, something like that. And the second part is that we have people who are leaving positions, either willingly or unwillingly, taking institutional knowledge with them, both explicit knowledge, which is easily transferable, archivable and easily regained, or tacit knowledge, which is really unique to the individual or specialist and very hard to recreate. And both of these kinds of knowledge are being lost really in real time as we speak right now today. And so, why does it matter? The bottom line up front, we'll never be able to recreate the knowledge, structures, systems, and research conducted and stored by US government or US government adjacent organizations, even if there was a desire to. And more broadly, for those outside of the US, as we lose shared knowledge, we actually will make worse decisions that will harm our health, economy, social networks, livelihood, and overall well being. And that we even see issues worse than this, which is that the losses of knowledge are having us causing us to make decisions that actually end people's lives, that promote and promulgate war and conflict. So not only health, economic well-being, social networks, livelihoods, but actually even more dire consequences than that. And again, why does it matter? It's part of a broader problem. It's not just an issue of, knowledge commons or knowledge sharing, which doesn't seem like a very sexy topic, right? It doesn't seem like it's quite as pertinent maybe as others, but in actuality, it is one of the sort of bedrock problems of an attack on expertise that was once used to drive policy decisions across all sectors. And I'll show a little bit later, when you look at knowledge loss and knowledge commons, we see it in the fishing sector, we see it in agriculture, we see it in military, we see it in infrastructure, development aid, et cetera. So it's across all sectors. And it's not unprecedented. It's something that is often done to disrupt and control discourse by limiting what can be known. And in particular, government data is the kind of data that provides fundamental records of how societies work, like health, social, economic, and educational data that shows how people live. And that can also help us build on ways to help people live better. And eliminating this data collection breaks the system of knowledge that allows government to work well, and also that maintains any kind of public transparency. And so without data, we can't answer questions like what impact are climate related disasters having, or what is the inflation rate? They're unanswerable. And knowledge is no longer seen or valued as a common good. And again, why I think this is really important is because it does have somewhat of a quick or an easier fix to start than some of the other issues that we deal with. So the scope of the problem, I just wanted to show in Mother Jones, one of the a publication. It says it's like areas going dark on a map during a power outage, losing access to vital knowledge from longtime employees, as well as essential information domestically and internationally that federal researchers have gained over decades and is unlikely to ever be reassembled. Science, land management, international aid, emergency response, national parks, and federal infrastructure, the effect is the same: a sudden, widespread uncertainty about basic things we used to know. And again, in the conversation, we have this concept of vanishing data, right? Undermines good public policy with global implications. And everything I'm saying, although it's related to the US context, because that's where I work and live right now, is relatable across the rest of the world. And we see these kinds of attack on knowledge and knowledge commons all over. And we also see the impact stemming from US across the rest of the world. And for our international folks joining us, I'm sure that you know and feel this just as acutely as we do. And so I just wanted to show that there is some documentation taking place of what's been lost. Wikipedia has actually a pretty good entry of 2025 US government online repository removals. And also the Partnership for Public Service has a federal harms tracker. But you can see again, across all agencies and sectors, the scope of this problem is incredibly widespread. And so I'd like to go into a case study to elucidate this a little bit more before going into some ways forward and a call to action. And so, what I decided to do very, very simply when thinking about sort of what is the scope of this problem and how can we look at it, especially through an atrocity prevention lens, is I simply asked an informal group of atrocity prevention experts and professionals, some of whom are here on this call today, former and current government and government adjacent personnel, what knowledge did they feel was lost? And so I'm going to present a summary of their responses just so you can see the diversity and scope just from this small group of about 15 or 20 practitioners. And so I wanted to show, for example, and many of these things were marked as this and this and. So this is a summary of things that were really agreed upon by the group, or seconded, third, fourth, et cetera, by the group. But if we look at the specifics, all of the data collection and drafting apparatus for the Elie Wiesel report, all of the expertise in advanced analytics, all of the expertise in drafting atrocity risk assessment frameworks, all of the atrocity prevention training capacity, all of the knowledge on transitional justice, and all of the knowledge on atrocity prevention and transitional justice programming, management, and implementation, all of the atrocity risk assessment frameworks produced, 3 years of atrocity prevention interns, virtual student federal service, about 12 people per year, producing student authored atrocity risk assessment frameworks on non-priority countries, all of the country specific research that never even made it to an ARAF, all of the context indicators and local knowledge sources that we built into our programs. And the person said, for me, this is devastating. This is how we would understand over time which things were changing, which allowed us to raise alarm bells. And process loss is huge, especially for prevention. The atrocity prevention community had mechanisms to share analysis across defense, development, and diplomacy agencies. And for those of us working in this space, we know how hard it is to develop and actually have a functional mechanism to share analysis across these spaces. So I just want to sit with this for a minute and look at the scope just for this small group of atrocity prevention practitioners. And if you can imagine, across women, peace, and security, across, you know, early warning in addition to atrocity prevention, across conflict stabilization, all of these places have things that were lost. The next thing I wanted to mention was that in addition to knowledge lost from individuals and from practice that had been done, an example of a large repository that had been taken down. The USAID Development Information Clearinghouse, DEC, was dismantled. It had been around since 1975 and had over 150,000 publicly available documents, including all of USAID's non-classified and SBU program evaluations of atrocity prevention, humanitarian protection programming, conflict assessments. If you can imagine over 150,000 publicly available documents disappearing overnight, multiply that by however many programs, departments, et cetera, have been shut down, closed, and have been literally vanishing. The scope of this is huge. And so thinking about knowledge prevention as both a challenge and an opportunity, and this will set us up for our next two speakers today. If data destruction is an act of suppression, then data preservation can be an act of resistance. So thinking about the challenge of data destruction as an act of suppression, then it can be an act of resistance. And so the first thing I wanted to mention is just the simple basics in possible ways forward of creating a non-cloud based copy of everything. Now, I know this sounds a little bit ridiculous, but for those of us who have worked in the archival world for a long time, um, creating a non-cloud based version is a documentation best practice to try and save information in multiple places, creating an offline copy of the record, and creating, again, multiple copies, which can help counteract the random takedown of conflict, of materials. Um, and so we know this is not possible for everything given the size, et cetera. But when I talk about partnerships, we'll see how this might be a way to help store. The second thing is to use new platforms to create collaborative documentation and preservation plans. And what I mean by this is people are already filling in the gap with the closing of entire departments in the federal government, in UN system, et cetera, international NGOs, and the trickle down of staff loss in different regions. People who have worked together on similar issues are coming together. They're coming together on Signal, they're coming together in other places and are ready to be able to try and help preserve this information. And so even if you're in your official capacity or you're not, figuring out where is this information and how can we actually partner, and this is my third point, how can we actually partner with larger institutions, university centers who are not related or affiliated with government, large NGOs can actually help host a repository of online materials, even if it's as small as just program evaluations or just things that went into working toward a certain bill. If we're able to take small bites of this and partner, then it's a relatively low cost way to save entire portfolios and bodies of research and knowledge from being lost. And so that's where I want to conclude at my call to action. So right now, creating collaborative documentation and knowledge preservation plans are actually relatively easy ways to combat knowledge loss. I urge larger organizations to lean into generosity for these efforts that don't require significant additional funding or resources. And when I say they don't require significant, they require some, but not significant in terms of the scope that might be prohibitive. And organizations can reach out and offer to host repositories or project archives. Groups should also reach out to organizations and ask them to host, because this is the only way we're going to figure out who has capacity and who's able to host these so that we don't lose any more knowledge in the future. So I'd like to end there and thank you. I will stop sharing my screen and happy to answer questions either here. And if we don't have time, then please email me. Happy to continue the conversation. Thank you to the APL and HHI for having me, and looking forward to the rest of the presenters today.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, as Sam mentioned, please drop your questions and comments in the Q&A section. If we have time towards the end, we will definitely take up some of your questions, but please feel free to use the Q&A. And also keep dropping your name and introducing yourself in the chat. I think Sam's presentation was really spot on. I did have a few questions myself, but I can leave it for the discussion section. And I think, it's really, what really strikes me is that the idea of knowledge commons is not simply about data storage, right? It's about cultivating trust, collaboration, shared stewardship over knowledge that can save lives. So let's begin exploring that subject a bit more with our next presenter. And the next presenter is, I believe, Peter.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning to all who are in today. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you. I believe that perhaps you are able to see my screen and you can also hear
Yes.
me clearly. Thank you. So I'm going to complement what Dr. Samantha has presented with a specific overview of what we have here in Kenya. And to start us off, as introduced, my name is Peter Momachi. I come from Kenya, but I've had experiences across Kenya, East Africa, specifically here in Kenya and in Uganda on conflict early warning and peace building. The conflict early warning and early response mechanism under the IGAD. They call it the C1, as well as some stints in Nigeria, specifically Kaduna and Plateau states. So while looking at this subject of institutional memory loss, I think I'll start from the point where my experience as a practitioner is that at the moment, the developments with USAID and related institution have tended to exacerbate the risk of institutional memory loss. However, this phenomenon has all along been prevalent. I think it's happened and it will continue to happen. So with that, we have a duty to try and ensure that we document as much as possible so that we don't keep on losing all this memory. But also, as we document it in a way that then becomes useful, accessible, and helpful to practitioners. So as I've said, my point of reference will be the Kenya National Conflict Early Warning and early response infrastructure. To those who are familiar with the Kenyan system, there are those who will call it the WIANO Platform for Peace, and others the National Conflict Early Warning and Early Response System. So just a brief overview about it is that the infrastructure, as the name indicates, was established to forestall violence before, during, and after elections. Specifically, it came after the 2007, 2008 post-election violence. And in this case, it was very active during the electoral cycles of 2010. 2010 was a referendum period, a constitutional referendum. And because of what had happened in 2008, 2007, there was a lot of fear that the country would go back into violence. Again, it was replicated in 2013, 2017, and 2022. Now, in 2022, it wasn't as robust as it had been in the previous years. And this I will attribute, I could be wrong, but I will attribute it to part of the memory loss, that institutional memory losses that we are talking about, because as we moved from 2013, actually, in as much as it grew, there were elements of losses that attributed to factors that I'll be mentioning as we move forward. And specifically, this infrastructure was unique in that it brought together state and non-state actors. For once, in an African state, we were able to see a state, and in this case, I'm looking at security agencies working together with non-state actors, these being civil society organizations, development partners, donors. They could sit on the same table and talk about issues that would hitherto be referred as a domain of the security agencies, and therefore could not be touched by those that were deemed to be non-security personnel. And indeed, the system significantly contributed to the early detection of potential conflicts and hence the timely responses. And therefore, it was a very good infrastructure. Actually, looking through the media, through various reference points, there are anecdotes that explain about this initiative. However, it does not, or you wouldn't find a place where clearly it then gives the scope of how useful it was. And in fact, if one was to go to the institutions, initially there were 4 that were mandated with the implementation of it. Actually, it would be difficult to get any value or any information around it. So I would just mention a few of the factors that I think then have contributed and keep on contributing, not just in Kenya, but across the places that have been to the memory loss. Some of these have been ably discussed by the keynote speaker. And so I will just be adding some practical bits to it. Number one, there's the shift in priorities. And in this case, every time in the so-called democratic countries and so forth, every time there's a change in government, then there's also a change in government policies, government priorities. So some of the governments, while initially they were looking at issues of peace and security, then they move towards looking at perhaps development. They go to look at perhaps issues of trade. So anything that was deemed to be perhaps looking at aspects of peace and such, then is left behind. And with that, then a lot of such, because the changes normally happen so abruptly and so fast. Yeah, so you find that means that there would be no funding for such programs and so forth. Then with it, there are aspects of contract lapses. And in this case, I'd be looking at, in Kenya, we have an institution called the National Cohesion and Integration Commission that specifically looks at aspects of hate speech. It was very proactive in the establishment of the National Conflict Early Warning Infrastructure, the WIANO Platform for Peace. However, as the law that establishes it states, it has commissioners whose contract lapse after every, I think it's 5 or 6 years. So you will find that those commissioners, once they leave, then new ones come in. And it doesn't always mean that whenever there's a change in the contract, then they will continue, or they'll come with the same expertise, they'll come with the same zeal and so forth. So those changes at the institutional level actually translate to huge changes in terms of what programs and therefore what is carried forward either in memory, probably what was in the process of being documented and so forth. So a lot is lost during those transition periods that are influenced by the priorities. Of course, also for the development partners, and in this case, I'm looking at the donors because they fund most of these projects and interventions as they change in terms of what they consider value for the money that they give, then there's always that loss. Then the other aspect that is normally a problem is the information data secrecy. And in this case, there's normally a lot of secrecy that is shrouded in data and information, especially for those of us who work in the domain of early warning. Because number one, there's the aspect of institutional secrets. All institutions, whether civil society organizations, whether academia, whether development partners, whether governments, they have that which they consider internal. So even when we document as much as we want to do, there are those things that would be left undocumented because they are considered they are not fit to be exposed to the outside world. Then secondly, on that is the question of censorship due to political sensitivities. Projects that touch on atrocities, projects that touch on peace, projects that touch on early warning tend to be politically sensitive. And in this case, whenever something is being documented, say for instance, whether it's an activity, it's an occurrence, then the authors have to be very careful on how diplomatic they are with whatever it is that they are putting down. And with that, a lot of information is normally lost. A lot of memory is put aside. And then finally, on that point is the question of narratives that appear contradictory to the main narrative. And this one will mostly touch on the questions or on the areas of reconciliation, of truth, justice, and reconciliation commissions, and so forth. So there's always that main narrative that is adopted. So whenever there's a narrative that seems contrary to that, then definitely it would be reduced, partly because either the actors or it is seen that that narrative that is contradictory is likely to open up other wounds or is likely to negate the positives that would have been achieved. Then the other factor is the documentation purpose. And when I talk about documentation purpose, I'm looking at what are the impacts, what is the use. I mean the impact in terms of the use and access of this documented story, if I may call it as such. Because one, if it is academic, then the question becomes, where is it stored? Who can access it? Is it in a language that any person can actually access, can read it, can be able to implement it, and can associate it with the certain institutions and so forth? Then we also have the documentation, the programmatic. Those for us who are running programs, then would be looking at, of course, the monitoring and evaluation reports, the midterm review reports, and so forth. Yes, they carry a lot of memory, but again, who has access to this? Most of these are just stored within the institutions, within probably just shared with the funders, and that ends it. Okay. Then there's also the journalistic, I would say journalistic documentation. And again, that one is basically just a story. And again, who can access that and so forth. And of course, for those who come from the region that I come from would identify with the phrase, if I say that newspapers are for wrapping meat. So a lot of that information then would be lost. The other factor is then the technological changes. We are all aware of the global advancements in terms of the technology, and therefore a lot of information then keeps on getting either eroded because it does not comply or it does not resonate with the current technology. And then allow me to end that with the question of the resource gaps. A lot of institutions would want to create memories of memories, whether it is of projects and so forth, but the question is, do they have adequate resources to do that? If they have the resources to do that, do they have the resources to ensure that their reports and documents are shared across? Okay. So finally, just a few recommendations. I think from where I sit, there's always the question of ownership and sustainability. Most of these projects tend to be owned not by the local communities, but by the people who are funding them. And in this case, therefore, then there's always a challenge to keep them going. Okay, so whenever there's a change or there's a gap in the resource availability, then it comes to an end, and that becomes the end of it. Okay, and also then that speaks to the question of sustainability. If it is a project that speaks to the government speaks to the national or speaks to the community at large, would it be possible to have them then owned by the community and by the government? And in this case, then I would be looking at, can they draw, if not the entirety of their financial support, a significant percentage from the national exchequer? That way, then there'll be a lot of continuity. And even if there was a change, or even if something happened as it happened to USAID, then there's continuity. If you come to my country, Kenya, at the moment, and I believe many countries, the projects that were being supported through funding from USAID came to an abrupt end. If there was some significant contribution to whatever they were doing from the national governments, then there would be some elements of continuity. And therefore, if the memory was to go, it wouldn't, I doubt if it would go, but even if it were to go, then a good percentage would remain. Then the question of creating complementarities and synergies. This one, I think the keynote speaker spoke about it in detail, so I won't belabor so much on it, but there's need to create, as we look at commons, knowledge commons, then we need to look at how do we bring together, whether it is academic institutions together with the practitioners, and therefore come up with the systems where information then is stored, is shared, and can be accessed easily. Then again, have the systems anchored institutions and not personalities. This relates to the example I gave of the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, whereby we can have continuity so that even as we have personalities or persons leaving those institutions, then those projects, those memories can still continue to exist and they can be passed on. And then finally, look at leveraging institutional memory on technology. Again, this was ably explained. So with that, thank you very much. And your questions are welcome. Thank you to APL, and thank you to all the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A section, and we will continue. If you have time towards the end, we will have a conversation with regard to what Peter presented, especially on the government priorities, the resource gaps, political sensitivities, how those can disrupt early warning systems, and those reflections are really valid. With that, I want to, because I'm keeping tab of the time, I want to kind of move over to our third presenter, Nate. Again, Nate has decades-long experience with the Fund for Peace, and he's going to present us with a mapping project of 1,700 organizations and their relationships. Over to you, Nate.
Thank you, Mads. And can you see my screen and hear my voice?
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, thank you to Peter Momachi and Dr. Lakin for your very insightful comments. Building on what you said, I want to talk a little bit about preserving the invisible infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure, we usually picture things like roads, bridges, or power lines. But there's another kind of infrastructure, as we've been saying, that's just as vital, yet completely invisible. It's the web of relationships, trust, and communication that allows institutions and communities to work together. So this presentation is about how we can preserve that invisible infrastructure, what we're calling network memory, so that progress doesn't have to start over every time a project ends or leadership changes. So the idea of network memory comes from the idea that organizations don't run just on policies and budgets. They also run on relationships. These networks of trust and communication form a kind of relational architecture that sustains collective action. But like any living system, that architecture can be very fragile, as we've seen. When projects end or institutions reshuffle, the people who hold those connections move on and the system begins to forget itself. Madge used the term institutional amnesia, which I think is really very well put. What we've tried to do through the Fund for Peace's social network mapping project is to keep that architecture alive, to preserve a record of who's connected to who, where influence lies, and how collaboration actually happens in practice. Because in fragile contexts, losing that memory doesn't just slow down progress, it actually breaks the continuity that makes atrocity prevention and resilience possible. This network mapping initiative began as part of Fund for Peace's long-term collaboration with regional actors in West Africa, including ECOWAS, PIN Foundation, USAID, and others, to try to understand not just where conflict occurs, but how organizations respond together. Over the past decade, we've mapped more than 1,700 organizations with over 2,100 connections among them across 15 West African countries, and each line in the map represents a real relationship. So partnerships, funding flows, coordination mechanisms, joint initiatives, etc. What emerges is the relational architecture of atrocity prevention in West Africa, showing where capacity is concentrated, where silos persist, and where new partnerships can create multiplier effects. And crucially, this map functions as a memory system. As donors shift or projects close, these relationships don't have to vanish from collective awareness. This map helps to keep them visible so that the next wave of initiatives can build on what came before instead of starting from zero every time. So what the map reveals, when you zoom into the map, you begin to see structure, not just a tangle of lines, but an architecture of relationships. So regional connectors, for example, can bridge national networks. They can play a stabilizing role. They can enable learning and coordination across borders, etc. And local hubs, meanwhile, are the engines of resilience. Community organizations, women's groups, faith leaders, actors who hold social trust and are the first responders when tensions arise. And then there are also peripheral nodes. They might be small or emerging organizations that could be isolated from the mainstream coordination structure, and proactively including them can help to expand reach and legitimacy. Sometimes we see very dense clusters, like in Nigeria or Ghana, that reflect strong collaboration. But in some cases, density might mean redundancy or insularity. And so we need to try to bridge across those dense clusters, because without bridging those ties, a siloed cluster can risk becoming an echo chamber. Finally, gaps in connectivity often trace back to geography, politics, or language barriers. And in those spaces, information just doesn't travel and opportunities for collective prevention are lost. And so seeing that in the map enables us to begin to try to find ways to optimize the overall ecosystem for atrocity prevention. So by making these patterns visible, the map helps to identify strategic points of leverage, places where connecting just one or two actors can have a cascading effect that will benefit the entire system. So why this matters for atrocity prevention? Ultimately, the map isn't just about visualization, it's about continuity and coordination, which are at the heart of atrocity prevention. When an institution restructures or a donor exits, the relationships that once enabled collaboration can just vanish overnight. The effect is like amnesia in a complex system. Actors forget who's connected to who, where trust exists or existed, and how information once flowed. So by preserving this network memory, we safeguard the capacity for collective action. We make sure that hard-won local relationships and knowledge don't have to be rediscovered every few years. The map also helps identify strategic connectors, organizations that bridge divides and spread information, and also gaps where the system is not communicating. By strengthening these linkages, we don't just prevent violence reactively, we build the architecture of prevention proactively. Ultimately, this is about ensuring that institutional transitions don't erase the invisible infrastructure that makes prevention possible. So the implications and next steps, they're practical implications, but also cultural. First, we need to start treating relationships as infrastructure, as assets that require investment and upkeep, just like roads or power grids. Every time we lose an institutional contact, a trusted intermediary, a community liaison, part of that infrastructure can collapse. Then we need to institutionalize memory by ensuring that new projects inherit the social and informational networks of those that came before. So you don't have to rebuild it again from scratch. So you can do things like everything that we've been talking about today, contact registries, cross-program learning, data continuity, and things like that. Third, we need to strengthen connectors, the actors who bridge sectors, countries, or communities. They're like the synapses in the prevention ecosystem. Supporting them is how we build resilience into the system. And then finally, the broader goal is to build shared platforms and cultivate a culture of collaboration. If we view data, lessons, and relationships as collective goods and not as property of individual projects, then we can create a true knowledge commons. I will, let's see here. Let me just show you this real quick. I'm not going to go into any detail at all, but it's just to show you that this is a dynamic map, not a PDF that can be filtered. The lines vary in width based on the strength of the relationship. You can see you can filter it and zoom in and zoom out, and it enables us to really begin to identify those strategic points of entry so we can optimize that ecosystem and have a multiplier effect and synergy and continuity so that resilience can be cultivated over time and again not lost every time we have an institutional reshuffling or the end of a project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nate, for that presentation. Really eye-opening stuff from all three of you. And what I was realizing is, this event, this webinar series, and this particular webinar by APL, which was founded to do something very ambitious and urgently needed, which is to strengthen innovation, collaboration, and the real-world impact of atrocity and conflict prevention work through spatial methods, technology, and shared learning. What we are talking about here is really preventing the loss of the prevention infrastructure globally. So we have been building over decades a atrocity prevention, conflict, violence, whatever you want to call it, prevention infrastructure for decades, and very much like your analogy of building roads and bridges, we are going to abandon all that. But here we're talking about preventing the loss of that prevention infrastructure. And what is really striking about the participants who introduce themselves is that the role that you all can play in this. And I know you were, passive sort of recipients of this information, but you don't have to. And I think that that there is an urgent need for you also to become part of this knowledge commons, to bring with you, what you have, your experiences, your information, your data, your relationships. Let's try to work together to tackle this issue of knowledge loss of the, let's try to prevent the loss of the prevention infrastructure. And try to preserve what we can well into the future. So please reach out to us at the email that we've shared with you. Please use these APL website and LinkedIn QR codes to join this initiative and spread the word. I have two quick questions that I want to kind of close with. But again, as a call to action, we are focusing on a funding crisis, knowledge loss, emerging threats, data to impact gaps that have always existed but will exacerbate over a period of time, and these interdisciplinary and community silos that will be abandoned or widened. I wanted to ask two quick questions, and I want to invite our participants, our attendees, to also think about these two questions and share your thoughts in the Q&A section. First question is, because we're talking about the prevention of not just data, but the people and the practices that give meaning to this work, to the prevention work. So knowledge preservation is only sort of a technical exercise. It's also relational, political, and a deeply human exercise. So the question that I wanted to leave us with is, what do you see as one barrier and one opportunity for building a global knowledge commons for atrocity prevention? And then the second question is, and how might academic institutions like ours at Harvard and beyond, the Atrocity Prevention Lab, which is at the heart of this work, which is more than a research initiative, it's a knowledge commons on its own, a space where early warning and early action practitioners, data scientists, technologists, scholars from across regions, because we've been dealing with this gap between the West and the East, or however you want to frame that, in terms of the practice and the research, the technology and the resources. We've been trying to bridge that. How can we play a more active role in sustaining that commons? So I want to kind of leave us with those two questions, and put those questions over to our three presenters as well, and then we can wrap it up.
Mads, do you mind if I jump in?
Yes, please.
Great. So I think that we've really outlined the challenges already. And I think that the challenges that already existed, particularly, the silos between disciplines, the barriers between sort of national, international level and local level, all of these things still exist. They will just get worse. And so I think that I've already outlined that. One place that I actually see for an opportunity is that, archiving knowledge or writing things down, etc., can sometimes be seen as an afterthought. Like we're just doing the project, we're doing what we're doing, and we're not documenting, we're not saving things in a central place, etc., till afterward. And I think just shifting that idea, as Nate said, that knowledge common it's a common good. And if I'm doing it, someone else should be able to do it. If I disappeared today, someone else should be able to pick up and shouldn't lose everything that I had worked for. And I think that this mindset of saying, documenting what I'm doing now for each person, each project, et cetera, and having that shared somewhere with your colleagues, is a good way to sort of prevent this from getting farther along. And then potentially once you have a small repository of what that project is doing or whatnot, update it and put it elsewhere, right? On someone else's server or something like that as you're going, so that we don't end up with a case where a whole project's been completed and we have no up-to-date or organized documentation. So investing in it in the first place and then building those collaborations.
Just to add one comment about like what the challenges might be. One challenge is that I think organizations often don't know the value of what they have in terms of data. And also a lot of the data is unstructured, and so they don't even know how to make it relevant to anyone else, and they can't imagine how it might be relevant to someone else. So I think this speaks to the second question that you raised, Mads, about academics. I think academics oftentimes know how to make like raw unstructured data useful and meaningful. So there's a real opportunity for collaboration, I think. And when you have a disruption like we have in the industry right now, things are going to get lost just because not because of malice or even concerns over intellectual property or sensitivities and political will or whatever, although all of that is real, it's just going to happen in the reshuffling. And so I think academics can play a very important role in helping us to know what can be retained and how it can be useful.
Thank you. I think one area that could work well is the creating of goodwill, especially when you look at governments, when you look at non-governmental institutions. I experience a lot of times that there's a lot of pushback from the government, and in this case, it's more of individuals. But most of the time, the pushback comes even without a proper scrutiny what is being pushed back. So I think there's need to engage and engage and engage from the beginning to the end. So I think that one also telling with creating meaningful partnerships would go a long way in ensuring that there's goodwill through and through. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. So I just want to wrap things up. I want to thank each of our panelists, Dr. Samantha Larkin, Nate Haken, and Peter Momomachi, for sharing your experience and wisdom. Today's discussion reminds us that preserving knowledge is itself an act of prevention. When we lose institutional memory, we lose time, we lose trust, and too often we lose the opportunity to act early. But when we build knowledge commons rooted in openness, collaboration, mutual care, we give future generations the tool to respond faster, smarter, with greater solidarity. And today's presentation reminded me of how many assets we still have available. So part of it is talking about the gaps and what is the need and the deficiencies, but we also have a lot of things that we build up over the years. So, it might also be a good idea to start thinking about an asset-based approach to this. Who can help sustain these existing assets, kind of changing the landscape of who sustains these assets, whether the assets themselves can sustain themselves over a period of time, and really looking at the strengths and not as not in terms of weaknesses or what's missing, funding, etc. And data in this case is a huge asset. Institutional knowledge is a huge asset. So I want to thank our audience for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our next webinar in this series. And we've already kind of shared those links, so please sign up ASAP to those. We'll continue exploring how innovative data, networks, and community practices are shaping the future of atrocity prevention. Thank you for participating and take care.